They didn't erase her because she failed. They erased her because she learned how to win without asking permission. She built power in silence, and that quiet frightened a city addicted to noise and force. History carved statues for the men who ruled the streets, then buried the woman who controlled the rules. When the city finally moved against her, it didn't draw guns, it drew paperwork, laws, and polite ruin. The moment she became visible was the moment everything she built was taken from her. This is the story of power that refused to be loud, and why history tried to make sure it never spoke again.
They say New York forgives no one. It doesn't punish you loudly, it simply waits. And when you finally believe you've survived it, the city changes its rules and asks what you're willing to lose to stay standing. She arrived without ceremony, without witnesses. No trumpet of arrival, no one waiting on the platform. Just a woman stepping into a city that had already decided it would not notice her. The air was colder than she expected, not just in temperature, but in temperament. It moved through her coat and into her bones, as if testing her resolve. She carried one small case. Inside it, folded dresses, a few coins, and a silence she had learned long before she ever saw America. Harlem in those early days was loud with becoming. Music spilled from open windows. Laughter rose and vanished just as quickly. People walked fast, as if speed itself might protect them from disappointment. By day, she worked, where work allowed itself to be found, scrubbing floors, pressing shirts, carrying parcels through streets that never slowed for her fatigue. The pay barely held her together, but she carried herself as though she expected more from life and expected life to eventually agree. By night, she watched, from corners, from stoops, from the quiet safety of shadows. Harlem taught her early that survival belonged to those who listened longer than they spoke. She learned its rhythms, which streets breathed easiest after midnight, which doors opened for smiles, and which only opened for silence, which men mistook charm for power, and which ones understood numbers. It was on one of those evenings, guided more by instinct than intention, that she paused outside a narrow tavern marked by a single red lantern. The light flickered. Inside, laughter pressed thick against the glass. A man stood at the door, tipping his hat with practiced ease. He called himself Duke. Whether that was his name or his ambition, she never asked. His voice moved quickly, like a song half learned. He spoke of the city as if it belonged to him, of back rooms and quiet deals, of money that moved faster than the law. She listened, not impressed, not alarmed. Listening was its own form of protection. For a time, she allowed herself to be near him. They shared meals in cramped cafes where the coffee tasted burnt and hopeful. They walked Central Park after midnight, speaking of futures neither fully believed in. But charm, she learned, often hid brittleness. Duke promised more than he could deliver. He looked at women like trophies, at men like obstacles. When his luck turned, as it always does for men who mistake risk for genius, he vanished. Days later, she heard what had happened. A dispute. A gun. A body left on the street like punctuation at the end of a careless sentence. She wept once, quietly. Then she folded her grief the way she folded everything else, neatly and out of sight. The city did not pause for her sorrow, so neither did she. After Duke, there were others. Short arrangements, fragile alliances. One ended in whispers, another in tragedy. Each taught her the same lesson. Depending on men was a luxury she could not afford. She changed her name, not to hide, but to prepare. The new name sounded deliberate, measured, European enough to command respect, strong enough to discourage questions. Under it, she began to notice something Harlem hid in plain sight: hope. Not the kind preached from pulpits, but the small, desperate hope traded in nickels and whispers, the kind that lived in numbers chalked behind counters, in bets folded carefully into pockets, in chance treated like currency. She watched the men who ran it, their ledgers, their habits, their mistakes. She saw how greed made them careless, how pride made them predictable. At night, she sat by her window as lamps flickered on across the city. Each light felt like a calculation, each street a possibility. The island she had left behind, the cold, the loneliness, all of it had sharpened her. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, a train horn sounded, long and low, like a warning or a promise. She closed her eyes and listened. If this story already has you leaning closer, stay with it. Some stories don't announce their turning points. They whisper them. When dawn arrived, Harlem looked different, not kinder, but clearer. And she understood something then. The city did not reward innocence. It rewarded discipline. She straightened her coat, stepped back into the street, and began, very quietly, to plan. The city did not announce its lessons. It repeated them until you learned, or disappeared. She learned. In the mornings, Harlem moved with a kind of practiced exhaustion. Milk carts rattled over uneven streets. Shopkeepers lifted their shutters like tired eyelids. Newsboys shouted headlines that sounded important but changed nothing. She became part of that movement without ever belonging to it, a figure who passed through routines without being claimed by them. The grocer nodded. The seamstress called her name through an open window. Recognition arrived quietly, without familiarity. She watched the numbers game from a distance at first, not from the tables or the back rooms, but from the margins, from the way money moved faster than hands, from how hope folded itself into paper slips and traveled street to street like prayer. At night, she followed the rhythm of it, runners moving lightly, never stopping long, bets whispered at barber chairs, at bakery counters, behind hymn books, a network built not on force but on trust. That fascinated her. Force attracted attention. Trust endured. One evening, curiosity drew her into a narrow tavern off 7th Avenue. No sign, just a single bulb buzzing over the door like an insect that refused to die. Inside, smoke pressed low against the ceiling. Men spoke in murmurs, their faces half lost beneath hats and fatigue. They noticed her immediately. A woman among thieves always did. Some laughed, others stared. She took a seat without asking permission. When she spoke, the room changed, not because her voice was loud, it wasn't, but because her questions were precise. How were the numbers chosen? How were disputes settled? Where did profit leak away? At first, the answers came slow, guarded, then freer. Curiosity has a way of disarming suspicion. They realized quickly that she wasn't there to be impressed. She was there to understand. She studied their ledgers like scripture, memorized patterns, noted inconsistencies. The flaws revealed themselves easily once she stopped looking for drama. Too much cash held too long, too many hands touching the same envelope, too much ego, not enough order. Greed made them sloppy, pride made them blind.
Within weeks, she knew their arithmetic better than they did. One of them offered her a seat at the table, not out of generosity, out of instinct. She accepted, not because she wanted power, but because power, when ignored, becomes dangerous. The numbers business appealed to her for a reason she did not speak aloud. It obeyed rules, probabilities, records. It was chaos pretending to be chance, and she understood how to discipline chaos. She did not rush. Rushing invited mistakes. Mistakes invited graves. Instead, she built slowly, quietly. She chose her runners carefully, people with families, people who needed consistency more than excitement. She paid promptly, never argued over cents, never missed a day. Her rules were simple: move discreetly, pay on time, speak little, keep your word. The neighborhood noticed. Trust spread faster than rumor. Soon, slips bearing her numbers traveled further than her name. Her operation didn't expand, it settled. Others flaunted wealth, she treated it as defense. Her clothing grew finer, but never loud. Her home modest, but orderly. Nothing that invited envy, nothing that suggested hunger. Power, she believed, should whisper. At night, she reviewed her ledgers by lamplight. Numbers calmed her more than prayer ever had. They did not betray, they did not lie, they obeyed. Still, prosperity carried its own loneliness. Friends became employees. Conversation turned into negotiation. Even admiration felt edged with threat. Sometimes she missed the simplicity of being unknown, the ease of invisibility. But she did not indulge that longing for long. The city punished nostalgia. As the decade turned, whispers followed her steps. Men from downtown, new interests creeping north, Italian families grown bold during Prohibition, now hungry for something else. One name surfaced again and again, spoken carefully: Dutch Schultz. She said nothing. Silence was often the safest currency. But late at night, as she sealed envelopes and extinguished lamps, she felt the air tighten. The calm before storms always carried a particular stillness. One night she stood at her window breathing in the city. Cold smoke, fried onions, rain caught in metal. Below, the streets emptied, runners gone, ledgers closed. The clock struck midnight. Its echo lingered longer than usual. Somewhere far off, a car engine sputtered, then disappeared. A door slammed. She felt it then. A shift. Small, invisible, certain. Tomorrow, the numbers would still sing. Hope would still be sold in careful folds of paper. But beneath that music, another rhythm had begun. Footsteps, threats, hands reaching for what she had built. For now, though, the night belonged to her. She lay down, listening to the city breathe. And in the soft movement of the curtains, she could almost hear the future learning her name. If you want to know how long a woman can hold power without drawing blood, stay close. The city is about to test her. Power never arrives all at once. It gathers, it listens, and then it decides whether you are an obstacle or an acquisition. By the time she felt it fully, Harlem had already begun to change its posture around her. People spoke her name differently now. Once it had carried curiosity. Now it carried calculation. She walked the avenues with the same calm she always had,
But the city no longer looked past her. Men paused mid-sentence when she entered a room. Runners straightened without being told. Even the police, once careless in their indifference, began to watch with eyes that lingered too long. Attention was a tax she had never intended to pay. The whispers about Dutch Schultz grew louder. He was not a man who hid his appetite. Downtown had grown too small for him. Harlem, with its numbers and its money flowing through unseen channels, looked inviting. She understood men like him. They mistook dominance for inevitability. They believed fear could replace trust. It never did. When the first emissary arrived, she did not meet him. She sent tea instead. Warm, polite, dismissive. The second came with smiles and compliments. He spoke of partnerships, of shared futures, of how easy things could be if she understood her place in the order of things. She listened, then thanked him for his time. When he left, she adjusted her accounts, moved routes, changed codes. Preparation was not defiance, it was survival. The city, however, thrives on escalation. Soon, Schultz's men began to test her edges. Runners questioned, collections delayed, rumors planted like small explosives meant to detonate quietly. She answered none of it publicly. Instead, she tightened her discipline. Every slip accounted for, every payment exact. No arguments, no exceptions. Her people noticed. Fear wavered. Loyalty held. What Schultz underestimated, what most men did, was that her power did not rest on intimidation. It rested on rhythm. Harlem's numbers did not need violence to function. They needed reliability, and she provided it. When Schultz finally demanded a meeting, she agreed, not out of submission, out of clarity. They met in a room that smelled of cigar smoke and impatience. He talked first. He always did. He spoke of territory, of hierarchy, of how things were done among men who mattered. She let him finish. Then she spoke. Her voice did not rise. It did not sharpen. It simply laid out facts. Her operation did not bleed. It did not cheat. It did not provoke attention. Any disruption, she explained, would cost more than it gained, for everyone. Schultz laughed. Men like him always laughed before they lost patience. The meeting ended without resolution, which meant it ended in danger. From that moment on, the city held its breath. Gunfire became more common. Storefronts boarded faster. The jazz slowed, as if the music itself had learned caution. She walked through it all, untouched. But untouched did not mean unaffected. At night, she began to feel the weight of vigilance settle deeper into her bones. Sleep came lightly. Dreams came armed. One evening, as winter approached, she closed her office early and walked alone. Mist clung to the street lamps. A church choir practiced nearby, their voices tentative, searching for harmony. She paused outside. The melody was simple, old, the kind you learned before language, before ambition. For a moment, she let it wash over her, thought of her mother, of the island, of how far calculation had carried her. Power had given her control, but it had taken ease. When the song ended, she turned away. A gust of wind carried coal smoke and lilies. Somewhere, a door closed. The echo lingered longer than it should have. That night, she understood something she had avoided naming. The battle ahead would not be fought with guns. Those were too crude, too visible. It would be fought with paper, with law, with men who smiled while they dismantled lives. The city had tolerated blood. It would not tolerate exposure. And she knew, deep down, that if the gang wars ended, the law would come looking for its share. Still, she did not retreat. Retreat invited pursuit. Instead, she prepared differently. She kept records, careful ones, names, dates, patterns. When the city wanted arithmetic, she would give it arithmetic. When the first subpoena arrived, crisp paper, red seal, she laughed softly, not because it amused her, but because it confirmed what she had always known. Every empire ends twice, once when it loses its force, and again when it becomes visible. She dressed carefully the morning she went downtown, not for defiance, for precision. The courtroom smelled of polish and ambition. Men filled the benches with pens poised like weapons. They expected noise, they expected spectacle. What they got was composure. She answered questions the way she ran numbers, patiently, accurately, without embellishment. Yes, the police took money. No, not from her. Yes, raids favored some and punished others. Yes, she kept records. When she produced them, the room changed temperature. Silence thickened. For hours she spoke, not in accusation, but in totals, in patterns too consistent to ignore. When she finished, even the stenographer hesitated. The city would call her many things after that day: reformer, criminal, reluctant heroine. She accepted none of it. Vindication was not justice, and justice, she had learned, always sent the bill later. As she walked out into the gathering dusk, papers fluttered around her feet like pale birds. She paused only once, then stepped forward, because whatever came next, the city had finally admitted it needed her. And that, she knew, was when survival becomes something far more dangerous. Stay with this story, because the quiet victories never last, and the reckoning is already moving. The city congratulated itself too quickly. Newspapers called it a cleansing, a correction, a necessary reckoning. Committees formed, badges changed hands, a few names were quietly retired from public memory. For a moment, it almost felt like justice. She knew better. The law, she had learned, never arrives to restore balance. It arrives to reclaim control. In the weeks after her testimony, the noise around her softened, not disappeared, softened, like a predator learning new terrain. Flowers arrived at her door, letters praising her courage. Even strangers tipped their hats with something close to reverence. She accepted none of it as protection. Admiration was a poor substitute for immunity. Behind the scenes, the city adjusted its posture. Audits replaced raids. Tax notices replaced threats. Men who once ignored her now requested meetings in offices with polished floors and polite smiles. She attended them all, listened, answered only what was asked, never volunteered more than necessary. Her business survived the mafia. Whether it could survive bureaucracy remained uncertain. Slowly, regulations multiplied, permits questioned, accounts delayed. The margins tightened until even precision felt fragile. She began to feel something unfamiliar: fatigue. Not the exhaustion of hunger or fear, but of vigilance sustained too long, of living every day like a chess match with invisible opponents. At night, she found herself longing for simplicity, for mornings that did not begin with calculations, for silence that was not earned. Winter passed. Spring arrived hesitantly. One afternoon, she noticed how the light fell differently in her office, how dust settled on ledgers that once demanded constant attention. The empire still functioned, but it no longer required her hunger to sustain it. That realization unsettled her more than any threat ever had. Power, once achieved, rarely tells you when it's time to let go. The hearings ended. The judge declared victory. The city moved on. She did not. She spent more time in her small garden behind the townhouse. Lilacs grew there, stubborn against soot and neglect. She read French novels in the afternoons, slow stories where ambition rarely survived the final page. Sometimes she wrote, not memoir, not confession, fragments, thoughts about balance, about fate, about the cost of mastery. New York, she wrote once, does not love you. It reflects you until you forget who you were before the reflection mattered. Evenings were the hardest. She lit a single lamp, read the newspaper with its endless procession of disasters. On the table beside her rested an old revolver, polished, unused. A relic, not of violence, but of readiness. One night, buried deep in the classifieds, she found a small article. A new commissioner promising clean relations with Harlem. She smiled. Clean slates, she thought, belonged only to those who never wrote anything worth remembering. Outside, the wind rose again. It moved through the curtains like a presence, unsettling, familiar. The city was not finished. It never was. Soon after, the letter arrived. Plain envelope, official tone, a summons. This time there was no laughter. The hearing was not about corruption, not about reform. It was about her operation, her accounts, her refusal to disappear. Downtown, the courtroom felt colder than before, more deliberate. The questions were sharper now, less curious, more transactional. How much? How often? Who benefited? She answered as she always had, with calm, with arithmetic. But the move had shifted. This was no longer a crusade. It was containment. When the verdict came, it arrived quietly, almost politely. Guilty. The sentence followed with the same careful tone, as if the city were apologizing for necessity. As she was led from the courtroom, a gust of wind scattered papers from a clerk's desk. They fluttered around her feet like pale birds. She paused, looked down. It struck her then how loud the world could be over a woman walking away quietly. Outside, Harlem waited, unmoved, unapologetic. The car door closed with a sound too final to misunderstand. The prison stood north of the city, low, gray, indifferent. Inside, everything smelled of erasure. Keys rattled, boots echoed, rules were recited without curiosity. Her cell was small, clean, a narrow bed, a wooden stool, a number painted on the wall. She stared at it for a long time. Numbers had once obeyed her. Now they defined her. That first night, sleep did not come easily, but fear did not come either. She had learned something most never did. Power could be taken. Discipline could not. If this story has carried you this far, stay with it. What happens next is not about confinement. It's about what remains when everything else is stripped away. Because the city may believe it has finished with her, but memory has its own arithmetic. Prison teaches time a different language. It stretches minutes until they feel like seasons, then compresses years into a single glance backward. The walls do not threaten, they wait. Her days began with routine stripped to its bones. A bell, a line, a count spoken without names. The women around her carried their own arithmetic of survival, some loud with defiance, others quiet with resignation, most somewhere in between, learning which parts of themselves could be spared. She learned quickly what could not be taken: posture, silence, the refusal to hurry. At first, the guards watched her closely. Power leaves a scent, and they could still smell it on her. But power fades quickly where uniformity is enforced. Soon she became simply another number moving through corridors the color of old paper. And yet something curious happened. Order followed her, not because she demanded it, but because she practiced it. She rose early, made her bed with care, listened more than she spoke. When disputes broke out, she did not intervene. She waited. Eventually, the women began to sit near her, not for protection, for steadiness. They asked her questions, not about the streets, but about endurance. How do you last when the future has been reduced to dates on a calendar? How do you keep from shrinking? She answered the way she always had, carefully, without sentiment. You choose what cannot be taken, and you guard it ruthlessly. In the evenings, when the lights dimmed and voices softened, she walked the narrow perimeter of the yard, counting steps, measuring breath. Numbers again became refuge. She composed sentences in her mind she never wrote down, thoughts about balance, about how every empire ends twice, once when it falls, and again when it no longer needs to be remembered. Letters arrived occasionally, short, respectful. Bumpy Johnson wrote the most often. He did not ask for instructions, did not offer promises. He wrote about Harlem, about how the streets had changed, how new faces replaced old ones, how the numbers still flickered in back rooms, quieter now, disciplined by habits she had left behind. He wrote about poetry, about how power, once exposed, learns to speak in different voices. She read his letters slowly, folded them neatly, kept them beneath her mattress like proof that memory still worked. Time passed, not mercifully, not cruelly, just thoroughly. When she was released, there were no crowds, no speeches, no apologies. The city does not escort people back into relevance. She stepped out into daylight that felt unfamiliar, too open, too loud. Harlem greeted her cautiously, like a place recognizing someone it had not expected to see again. She did not reclaim anything. She did not need to. Instead, she left. Spring found her near the sea, on Long Island, a modest house. Pale shutters, wild roses climbing where they pleased. The quiet unsettled her at first. No vendors, no jazz bleeding through walls, only the steady conversation between wind and water. But she learned its rhythm. Bumpy visited when he could. They sat on the veranda with tea or brandy, spoke of poetry, of politics, of how luck never leaves, it only changes direction. "Do you miss it?" he asked once. "The noise, the power?" She looked toward the horizon, where light softened into gold. "Power," she said, "was always borrowed. What I miss is certainty, knowing exactly what must be done." He nodded. "Peace," she added, "is a discipline. Most people mistake it for rest." In the afternoons, she tended her garden, read slowly, wrote fragments that no one would ever publish. Evenings were quieter now. The sea replaced the city's hum. The past loosened its grip. And yet memory has a way of resurfacing. Decades later, long after she had stopped needing to be remembered, historians began to trace her outline. A photograph here, a transcript there. Whispers passed down like careful heirlooms. Some called her a criminal visionary. Others, a reluctant reformer. Others still, a myth softened by time. The truth was simpler. She had refused erasure. Harlem spoke her name again, but softly, with affection, with awe. Plays were written, articles published, documentaries filmed, but the Harlem she had ruled no longer existed. It lived instead in rhythm, in the sound of a saxophone late at night, in the glimmer of street lamps after rain, in small acts of quiet defiance performed daily by those still walking the narrow margin between survival and pride. Her notebooks surfaced after her death, bound in worn leather, filled not with confessions, but with balance, reflections on fate, on dignity, on the mastery of oneself. The caretaker who found them read only a few pages, then closed the book. Some things, he understood, were not meant to be consumed. Meanwhile, the city continued its long metamorphosis. Buildings rose and fell. Music changed tempo. Faces changed shade. But beneath it all, certain rules persisted. Move discreetly. Pay promptly. Keep your word. Know the value of silence. If you've stayed with this story to its edge, consider staying with the ones that follow. Not all histories announce themselves. Some need witnesses, willing to listen longer than the city does. Because somewhere in the quiet arithmetic of memory that resists erasure, she remains. Not as queen, not as legend, but as equilibrium itself. And that is where this story leans, toward its final breath. There are endings that announce themselves. Funerals, headlines, dates carved into stone. And then there are endings that arrive quietly, after the world has already moved on. She lived long enough to watch memory loosen its grip on her name. That was not a tragedy. It was a relief. In the final years, her days followed no schedule worth recording. Morning light filtered through curtains stirred by salt air. The sea spoke in patient repetitions. Gulls argued over nothing that mattered. She rose early, not from urgency, but habit. Old disciplines never leave completely. They soften. They settle into the body. Sometimes she walked the shoreline alone, her steps measured, her coat buttoned against the wind. Other times she sat on the veranda with a book, open but unread, listening instead to the weather decide what kind of day it would be. Visitors came less often now. Bumpy had grown older, slower. Their conversations shortened, not from lack of meaning, but from shared understanding. They no longer needed to explain themselves. When he visited, they spoke of small things, the quality of the tea, a line of poetry that lingered longer than expected, the strange way time seemed to hurry once survival was no longer at stake. He brought newspapers sometimes. She skimmed them politely. The city appeared distant in print, abstract, reduced to problems that belonged to other people.
Harlem still changed. It always would. New buildings replaced old ones. New music rose where silence had once settled. The numbers game flickered on in different forms, carried by new technologies, new codes. But beneath it all, the grammar remained. Trust, discretion, balance. She did not correct the stories written about her. Myth had earned its place, and truth, she had learned, did not require defense once it had survived. In the evenings, she sometimes wrote, not history, not legacy, observations. That mastery of the world begins with mastery of oneself. That power, once unclenched, leaves the hand lighter. That silence, when chosen, is not absence, but control. One note, folded carefully and sealed without a name, was written years before the end. "If you are reading this," it began, "it means I have succeeded in leaving nothing undone." The final entry came later, written with steady hand. "Every empire ends twice, once when the world forgets its borders, and again when its ruler stops needing to be remembered. I have reached the second end. It is enough." When she died, there was no spectacle, no procession worthy of legend. Her house passed quietly to caretakers. Her belongings were sorted with care. The notebook placed in a drawer, meant to be returned to family no one could find. Years passed before curiosity overcame restraint. When the caretaker finally opened it, he expected confession, regret, secrets. Instead, he found gentleness, pages filled with balance, with acceptance, with the fragile dignity of ordinary life. No bitterness, no scorekeeping. He closed it again. Some things, he sensed, were not meant to be fully known. Harlem continued. The old streets shifted, the rhythms adapted, but certain echoes remained, in the way a shopkeeper kept honest accounts, in the way a woman refused to bow to insult, in the gambler who folded his ticket carefully before placing it in his pocket. Her presence lingered, not as ghost, but as structure, as rules that survived their author. Decades later, when historians gathered the fragments, they debated what to call her: queen, criminal, reformer, myth. Each word failed in its own way. She had not sought to be remembered. She had sought to remain, and that, quietly, she had done. On certain evenings, when rain softened the streets and street lamps glimmered like thought made visible, Harlem seemed to pause. Not in tribute, in recognition, because history does not always change direction with noise. Sometimes it pivots on refusal, on discipline, on a woman who learned the city's arithmetic and rewrote it without asking permission. If you've listened this far, carry her with you, not as legend, but as lesson, because stories like this do not conclude. They dissolve into the lives of others, unnoticed, indispensable, like salt in the sea.